Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, we are going to get into a topic that was actually sent to me as a question from the last Q&A podcast episode, but I wanted to be able to answer it in a little bit more depth, and so I saved it for today to have its own entire podcast episode. And the question that was sent to me was from a parent who was asking what types of things that they should be looking out for when looking for a new studio for their dancer. So that is the question that I want to answer today, or just sort of consider things we might be looking out for. And when we're looking at a dance studio for our dancer to go to, there are lots and lots of things we want to take into consideration. And today I'm only going to touch on things sort of from a dance physiotherapist perspective. There's obviously much, much more that you want to consider in terms of the environment that's being created and all sorts of other aspects that are important. And especially if you have a dancer who's going to be spending a lot of hours at a studio. But just in the interest of time and also in the interest of sticking sort of to my lane and the thing that I am more of an expert on, I just want to go through today what I would be considering to be important things from a dance physiotherapist perspective if I was looking for a new studio for my dancer. I also want to say that a lot of these same kind of questions or considerations are something that dancers could be taking into account if they are looking for future training programs. So this question came from a parent and they're looking for more of like a studio setting for their teen dancer. But if you are a dancer who's transitioning to maybe postgraduate training programs, apprentice type programs, second company programs, even company programs, anything like that, you can still consider some of these same things when you're researching environments and the types of programs that you're looking at. So I'm going to talk about it in the context of studios, but you can sort of read between the lines or listen between the lines, I guess, and use this information in other settings as well. I also just want to say that there are a lot of reasons why people might be looking to switch studios, and not all of them are because they're coming from a studio that was quote unquote bad. A lot of people might be looking for a new studio because maybe their previous studio closed, or maybe they've moved, or maybe they're looking for more specialized training in a certain genre of dance that the previous studio didn't offer. There are tons and tons and tons of reasons why people might be looking for a new studio. So again, the things that I'm going to bring up today are not necessarily saying that other studios are not doing this well. These are just the questions I would ask, or the things that I would be paying attention to if I was researching and looking into new studios and talking to studio owners or people at a new studio. So without further ado, number one, and these are in no particular order. I just have them ordered so I don't forget one, but they are not in any sort of particular order of importance. These are just things that go through my thought process. So number one, I would be interested in knowing what the qualifications of the teaching staff at that studio are. And I've talked about this before on the podcast episode, but there is no regulation within the dance industry in most parts of the world. And so there's no requirement for dance teachers to have any sort of qualifications. That does not mean that teachers do not have any qualifications. Many teachers have a lot of qualifications, but there's no requirement for that. So it is a question that I always encourage people to ask, to sort of say, what types of qualifications do your teachers have, or does your staff have? And it might be quite varied across the teaching staff. You might have some teachers at a studio who have specific syllabus qualifications. So maybe they are a qualified RAD teacher or ISTD teacher or ADAPT or any of the other numerous syllabus out there.
You might have teachers who have qualifications in the form of like a BFA or an MFA in dance, so more of a university like degree type pathway. You might have teachers that actually have qualifications in things that are maybe adjacent to dance, so even education, early childhood education, things like that. So it might look really, really different in different studios, but I would still be interested to know what that is. For a variety of reasons, I think it's always good to get a sense of, is this a studio that prides itself on or sort of, seems to hire staff that have higher levels of education and potentially qualifications? Or is it a studio that maybe is just hiring on former dancers that maybe grew up dancing there and then they're transitioning into teaching roles? And again, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but those people might have less formal education depending on what their background in teaching is. Another reason you'd really want to know this is if you're coming from a specific syllabus background and you want to be able to continue on, especially with exams and things like that, you want to know if that's an option at the new studio. So if you come, say, from ballet and you're coming from a Cicchetti background, is it a Cicchetti studio? Will you be able to continue to do Cicchetti exams, or is it using a different syllabus? Similar for, say, acro, are they acrobatic arts certified or some other governing body? So those questions just help you make informed decisions, but also maybe tell you a little bit about the level of education or qualification behind the teachers. There are also studios who may not follow any of these kind of established or recognized syllabus systems, but they may have their own type of in-house kind of syllabus and progressions that they follow in terms of, in our junior age range, these are the skills that we want the dancers to develop. This is the progression that they follow. Then we kind of progress into this at a more intermediate range and so on. So just because they're not a member of one of the governing bodies doesn't mean that they are not following some sort of structured kind of syllabus system in-house. But again, you won't know that unless you ask. It is not uncommon for me to hear about studios that don't have any of that structure in place. And so teachers are just left to kind of try and figure out on their own what skills or sort of steps are appropriate at a given level. They're given, say a junior jazz class, and it's up to them to figure out, okay, what kind of skill level are we at, versus other studios that are going to be really clear and say, at a junior jazz level, we expect all the kids to be able to do X, Y, Z by the end of the year, or that type of thing. So again, it just gives you an idea about maybe how that studio is structuring their classes and structuring progression between classes. So that is definitely something that I would want to know about, is qualifications of the teaching staff at the studio. And again, I'm not saying that there is a preferred one that you are looking for, but I think you want to know what those qualifications are so that you have an idea of how things are being taught at the studio. Number 2, I would be asking about the requirements for a background check or a criminal record check for all of the staff that are dealing directly with the dancers. Again, depending on what country you're in, this may be a requirement, but in Canada, at least in British Columbia, and I'm fairly certain in all of Canada to my knowledge, this is not a requirement. So anybody can open a dance school, anybody can become a dance teacher, and there's no legal requirement for those people to have any sort of background check done on them. Again, many studios will require that of their staff. So if you're working or you're sort of looking at any studios that are associated with any kind of municipal rec program, so things through like Parks and Rec and stuff, it most likely is a requirement. But private studios, it's up to them whether they require it or not. And so that is definitely a question I would be asking is, are your teachers or your staff, it's not even just the teachers, if there's other staff that are having direct, frequent contact with your dancers. So say there's a costumer at the studio who's in charge of doing all of the measurements and all of the costumes fittings for all of the dancers. They're having direct contact with your dancer. Those people, in my mind, should also be having some sort of a background check or a criminal record check done. I know that those checks are not perfect, but just knowing that a studio requires that of their staff tells you something about how they feel about safeguarding in children. So again, I would be asking that question, and potentially as a follow-up question, like how frequently they have to be updated, because it's one thing to require it when you hire somebody, but if you have a teacher who's been there for 20 or 25 years, have they had an updated one done? I know as a licensed physical therapist in the province, we have to have them done periodically as part of our licensure. And so they happen on an ongoing basis when we renew our licenses. It's not every single year, but they're happening regularly. So again, with the staff, it might not be necessary that they're getting updated every single year, but maybe it's every 3 years or every 5 years that staff that are ongoing staff are having to do an updated criminal record check. So I would be asking about that. And then the third thing that I would be asking about would be the requirement or certification of staff in terms of first aid or emergency management protocols. I did an entire podcast episode about this a couple weeks ago, so I will link that one in the show notes if you have not listened to that. But I would definitely be wanting to know or asking what the policy is on having teachers be first aid trained. And again, it may not be every single teacher on staff, but is there one teacher in the building at all times who is that designated first aid person? Or maybe it is that all teachers on staff are required to have current and up-to-date first aid. Again, different studios are going to manage it differently, but I think you are well within your right to be asking those questions. Those three questions, sort of teaching qualifications, criminal record checks, and first aid checks, they're questions that I think a lot of parents maybe sometimes feel a bit awkward asking, especially if you're, reaching out via email, or you're maybe doing a studio tour or something and you're just kind of starting to like get a feel for the place or trying to test the waters. But most studios, and certainly studios that have safeguarding and student safety sort of front of mind, are going to be more than happy to provide you with that information. If a studio is at all like hesitant or weird about providing that information to you, that to me is a bit of a red flag and would kind of get my spidey senses going. Every studio that I know who has protocols in place and is thinking about these things regularly is more than happy to share this information with any prospective families coming in. So I think, again, in an industry that has absolutely no regulation or oversight, unfortunately, it is up to parents to do their due diligence about where their dancer is going to be spending a lot of time. And so these are questions that do need to be asked and that you should not feel awkward asking, and especially if the studio is, following best practices, they're going to be more than happy to share that information with you. All right. Number 4 on my list. Yes, number 4. I would be asking questions about or asking for samples of what the timetable or class schedule looks like. And they may, depending on at what point you're looking for a new studio, they might not have the schedule for the upcoming season, although at this point in the year, studios will have that for the upcoming year. But if they don't, ask for what the schedule in the current year is for what level your dancer would be at. And there's a few reasons why I would be interested to know what that timetable or class schedule is. A lot of this has to do with sort of training load management and knowing where this studio is falling in terms of kind of overloading dancers or things like that. So I would be looking at the total number of hours that your dancer is being expected to dance in a week for their age or their level. I'm not going to get into training load recommendations right now, but I will link that episode in the show notes as well. If you haven't listened to that one, we do have recommendations on what the upper end of training load recommendations are so that we are not overtraining and risking injury in our dancers. So we want to know the timetable in terms of total number of hours in a week. And then I would also make sure that you're really clear about asking about extra rehearsals and practices, and whether that be regular private lessons or, prior to shows or prior to competitions, are there a lot of extra rehearsals or practices that are being added in? Because sometimes on paper, a schedule actually looks really reasonable in terms of the hours, but that studio has a model where they their regular training schedule is maybe not super, super intensive in terms of hours, but then they have a model where they add a lot of extra rehearsals leading up to a show or leading up to a competition. And so those hours actually aren't being calculated in their regular training schedule, even though those could be making up a very large portion of the training hours. So make sure that you ask about kind of requirements for that. And examples of this would be, if say studios are doing, say, a Nutcracker performance, those rehearsals are often separate from regular class time. So maybe they're on a Saturday or a Sunday, but in, September to December, maybe that's adding 6 or 8 or even 10 hours of extra like rehearsal time in a week that's not being included in the regular class schedule. I also am really interested in looking at or seeing what the days off are per week, because again, we can have training hours that are spread out more or less evenly throughout a week in terms of how the schedule is set up. And so is there a true rest day built into the schedule? Are there multiple rest days built into the schedule? And again, what happens to those rest days if there are extra rehearsals or practices that are expected? So in a lot of dance schedules, and this is what I see super, super commonly, is Sundays are often a day off. They don't have anything scheduled on the Sunday. But then I'm just going to keep using this example of Nutcracker practices because it's easy, but maybe all the Nutcracker rehearsals end up on a Sunday because that's when there's studio space that's available. So for, potentially 3 months of the season, maybe even more than that, maybe there effectively is not a rest day built into the schedule. So again, we want to really look at how these schedules are being structured so that we make sure that dancers, A, are not being overloaded, and B, have rest days built into the schedule and rest days that are protected built into the schedule as well. And then I would also be looking at the sort of timetable in terms of what are the regular breaks throughout the season. Most studios are going to be following school calendar breaks. So depending on where you are in the world, I would say generally that is common or that is the trend. But it is still important that you ask about that because it's becoming more common here, at least where I live, that we have, say, a 2-week break from school over the Christmas holidays, but some studios are actually starting to incorporate, again, kind of extra rehearsals, extra practices during that time. Or the same thing happens for spring break. Sometimes we have 2 weeks off of school, so you would maybe assume there's 2 weeks off of dance, but some studios only take 1 week off of the dance schedule, even though the kids have 2 weeks off of school. So just making sure that you know where there are breaks or if there are breaks scheduled into the training year, and then also what the expectations are throughout the summer time. Are there breaks that are built in? Do you have the whole summer off? Are there parts of the summer that are mandatory training? What are the start and end dates for the dance year? All of those types of things. Again, just to get a sense of how intense is this training load or training schedule going to be, and where are the natural breaks for periodization being built into this schedule. So that's number 4, asking questions about the timetables and the class schedules. So from like a daily and weekly perspective, but also over the course of the year. So we're thinking about breaks and downtime off dance as well. Number 5, I would be asking questions or looking for any information around, I'm going to call it supplementary training built into the dance schedule. And this is going to look really different depending on what studio you're at. And I'm using the term supplementary training rather than cross training because a lot of studios tend to include what they'll call, say, a stretch and strength class, or maybe they'll include Pilates, or maybe they even include yoga or something. But all of those things are very dance adjacent. So they are supplementary training in that they are focusing specifically on potentially strength or flexibility or those types of things, but they may not actually qualify directly as cross training because they might not be different enough from dance, if that makes sense. I actually do have a podcast episode about the difference between supplementary training and cross training. I will link that in the show notes as well. So if you want more information about that, I will put that there. It's from way, way, way back when. I think it was one of the first podcast episodes. So again, what sort of additional or supplementary training is being built into the schedule. And in some studios, that might look like some amount of kind of strength and conditioning on a daily basis. I know studios who have 30 minutes of it every day built into the first 30 minutes of their half-day program. And so the dancers are doing it really regularly. I know other studios who have something available like once a week. For instance, maybe it's a stretch and strength class or PBT or some sort of Pilates or something like that, and it's in the schedule once a week. And then I know other studios who might have something available for dancers to register for, but it is not part of their core training program. So there can be differences between whether that supplementary training is required or almost sort of like mandatory for a dancer versus something that is an option that people can register for if they want, but they don't have to. Again, there's not necessarily a perfect way or a right way to be doing this and offering this. Like every studio, it's going to look different depending on what levels of dancers you have and timetables and studio availability and things like that. But if a studio is even thinking about incorporating these things into their schedule, then that's often a sign that they are at least a little bit aware of the benefits of, strength training and supplementary training and hopefully cross training as well. In relation to that question, I would also be asking sort of who those classes are available to. So like I was saying before, sometimes it's going to be built into a schedule, but sometimes it's optional. And so if it is optional or it's a class you can choose to register for, who is able to register for that? Because a lot of studios have a minimum age on these types of classes. So maybe for 12 and up or 13 and up. But if you have a 10 or an 11-year-old dancer, are they going to be able to access that or not? Question to know the answer to. And again, if it is not something that the studio is offering or has available, then you just know that maybe it becomes more important for your dancer to be able to participate in other activities or other kind of cross-training activities outside of the studio. So I am not saying that every studio has to include these things because I know logistically it just doesn't happen. But if you're looking for a studio and you know that they don't include these things, then I'm going to be looking at, okay, what are my dancers' rest days? How much time do they have away from the studio, and how can we incorporate some other form of cross training on a day where they have a rest day from dance, so that you might have to be a bit more creative about how you implement that. And then the last thing just in relation to that is I would also just be asking questions about who it is that's teaching that supplementary training class, if it is something that does exist and is available on the schedule. So there are some studios who are going to bring in outside professionals to teach. So maybe it's a strength and conditioning coach, maybe it's a physical therapist, maybe it's a Pilates instructor, whoever it happens to be, but it could be an outside person coming in to teach that. And there's other studios where it's maybe going to be a dance teacher who's teaching it. And again, there's not necessarily anything wrong with a dance teacher teaching those types of courses, or classes, but what is their training to be able to do that? So this kind of comes back to that first question of what qualifications does your staff have? Because dance teachers on their own are not necessarily qualified to be teaching any sort of strength and conditioning unless they've done some sort of extra training or certification in those genres. So there are absolutely dance teachers out there who have done supplementary training in, maybe strength and conditioning or even PBT, or I'm trying to think of some of the other options out there like sugarfoot therapy or the elevate technique or things like that they might be bringing into the studio. But not every dance teacher is automatically qualified to be teaching any sort of cross training or strength and conditioning just because they are a dance teacher. So that's also something to think about as well, because sometimes some of the stuff that I see dancers working on in a strength and conditioning type class or a supplementary training class actually is occasionally somewhat questionable in terms of how useful it is or even how safe it is in some instances. So I would want to be knowing who it is who's teaching those classes if those classes are part of the timetable. And then moving on, number 6 on my list, I would want to know what types of relationships that studio has with any type of like healthcare providers or professionals within the community. And again, this is going to look really different depending on the studio or depending on the company. Like sometimes there are people that are actually on site. A lot of times that is not feasible for studios to have sort of an on-site provider, but do they have providers within the community, and not just physiotherapists, but potentially massage therapists or chiropractors or sports medicine doctors or nutritionists or sports psychologists, and the list goes on and on of professionals. Do they have professionals within the community that they have relationships with, that they are happy to refer to or work collaboratively with if the need arises? And again, this is just a question I would ask, not necessarily saying every dancer is going to need those services, but studios, again, that have a big emphasis on dancer health and wellness will often have networks within their community of people that they are referring to and happy to reach out to. I do not necessarily think that you need to always use the professional. So say you're coming from another studio or from another setting and you already have professionals that you have good relationships with. I don't think that you should be or need to be forced into using the people that the studio has relationships with. All I'm saying in terms of asking this question is, what is the openness of the studio to developing those relationships? So I know plenty of dancers who dance at studios where I have good relationships with the studio owner or teachers at the school. And there are lots of other dancers at those studios who see other physiotherapists or see other healthcare providers. That's great. I can't see everyone. It's absolutely not a problem at all. But again, just the fact that that studio is a studio who's open to their dancers seeking out that care outside of the studio is a big green flag in terms of knowing that they're going to support that dancer should an injury arise or should any sort of collaboration be necessary. So again, just a question to ask is, do they have any relationships or any type of networks with professionals in the community or professionals in the area? Even if you never plan on using them, I would still be asking that question and want to know sort of how open they are to forming those networks and that community. All right, last question, and this one's quite niche and it probably does not pertain to most people who are looking for a new studio. So this is kind of a little mini sub-question at the very end. But if you have a dancer who's training in ballet who is at an age where they are potentially getting ready to progress to point work, or even if they're a younger dancer who you think maybe in the future is going to be progressing to point work, I would also be asking what the process is for dancers being cleared to start point work. And again, studios are going to have different approaches to this, but there should be some sort of process of evaluation that dancers go through in order to know that they are safe to progress to point work. And so this could be teachers at the studio doing some sort of formal pre-point evaluation or assessment. Sometimes it's in the form of like a pre-point class that they're doing, and then they're kind of continually evaluating dancers throughout the year. It may be a studio who brings in an outside expert like a physical therapist or someone to come in and do an objective assessment. It may be a studio who refers you out to someone else. They might say, okay, go see this person in the community, have your assessment done and come back. It's going to look different in different studios, but what you want to see is that there is some sort of thought process and procedure in place that is looking at point readiness, that it's not just an arbitrary decision or something that's based solely on age or something that's based solely on, oh, well, all the rest of the members of their class are starting point, therefore everybody starts point in the class at the same time. You want to see that there's some sort of procedure in place that they are following in terms of actually assessing and determining point readiness. So again, I realize that question is like very niche and is not going to apply to the vast majority of people looking for new dance studios, but I did want to throw it in there because again, it just gives you some information about their approach to dancer health and wellness in terms of looking at like, are dancers truly ready and safe to progress to point work? All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. Those are kind of the main things that I wanted to highlight in terms of questions I would ask or things I would be looking for if I was looking to change studios or looking for a new studio for a dancer. Again, you can extrapolate some of that information to more company settings and stuff as well, but specifically it's looking at studio information for dancers looking for a new studio home. I hope that all made sense. Like I said, I definitely didn't cover all aspects of it. There's so much else to consider as well in terms of best fit for a dancer, but from a physio's perspective, these are the things that I would certainly be asking. If you have anything else that you would add to that list or questions about anything I covered in that, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me by email or on social media at Dance Physio Erika. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.